by the U.S. is extremely important. Now, Obama and Xi Jinping have their shirt sleeves and no tie, and they're walking around in this big estate by Annenberg in California, and everybody looks friendly and happy. But actually, the U.S. has been trying to conquer Asia and China since Teddy Roosevelt. They consider the Pacific to be a U.S. lake. They always had. The U.S. Naval High Command in the Pacific rules like kings and satraps and feudal lords until the Chinese Revolution came. Yeah. Okay. Now, this militarization is treacherous, relentless, and no matter how many smiles back and forth and handshakes and this and that, the Pentagon is going to continue. Now, what does the Pentagon learn and the U.S. ruling class learn about these kind of buildings? It had a lot to do with bringing the USSR down. How do you plan a socialist system when every 5 years you have to readjust your entire economy to some new military threat? You have to develop a new anti-ballistic missile system. You have to develop a counter missile to what they're doing. You have to have a new Navy. This is what the U.S. ruling class learned about the relationship between militarism and the destruction of socialism. Ronald Reagan inaugurated a $2 trillion military building during his year. It was called the Full Court Press. What did it do? It tried to bankrupt the USSR in a military race. Star Wars, I don't know if anybody remembers this.
FDR.
The SDR, right. But it did something else, politically. It terrorized the conservative elements in the bureaucracy and pushed them in a capitulationist direction. Now, I'm talking about the USSR. It had a lot to do with the rise of Gorbachev. What was Gorbachev's calling card? He was ready to give in on Eastern Europe and sell out the whole region in return for peace. So it had a political effect of terrorizing the bureaucracy into making a wholesale capitulation to the West in order to avoid drawing their fire in Eastern Europe. Now look at Korea. Look how dangerous this is. The conservative elements in the bureaucracy in China, and maybe some of the not so conservative elements, are saying, and they've said this out loud, I've read it. What are we doing? They're going to draw fire on us. They're going to draw the U.S.'s fire on us if they keep doing all this. The DPRK, by standing up, and the latest with the nuclear weapons. I'll get off after this. The thing about nuclear weapon is that the Koreans see this, talking about militarism, as a way of freeing up resources because they have a nuclear deterrent against the imperialists. They can free up resources to develop their national economy. And they've even said that. In the March plenum of the DPRK Workers' Party, they said, we have a new policy, nuclear deterrent and national development of prosperity. The two things are interlinked. Now the imperialists want to shove that back, force them into a military race, and further undermine the DPRK economically. At the same time, they're putting on sanctions. So the militarization in Asia is a very, very dangerous thing. Everybody has to be acutely aware of it, and its relationship to politics and counter-revolution. Oh, very quickly. I was trying to discuss China sociologically. and to say that Marxism determines the character of a society by its economic foundations, and that the political structure of that society based on that. Capitalist exploitation has given us capitalist society, bourgeois democracy, fascism, all kinds of stuff. But it's always based on the fundamentals of economic exploitation of the working class. In socialist society, you have planning, rational planning, production for human use and human need. In China, the foundation is not homogeneous. It's partly socialist, where there is planning, there are state enterprises, there's the Communist Party which directs it, and there's capitalists, both domestic and foreign imperialists. And what our job is to explain is that even though the superstructure and the foundation are not homogeneous, the socialist side is dominant in China. Planning, I can't do that. I want the comments that I don't have time. Planning, state enterprises, national development in a harmonious way based upon economic the rational method, which does not exist under capitalism, is the dominant method. And this was proved during the big crisis of 2008, 2009, when the entire capitalist world collapsed. Millions of workers were unemployed and still are. And the Chinese leadership jumped in, used plans that had been made to come into 2020, pushed them forward, and re-employed millions of workers in China who had been pushed out because they were based on exports in the economic zones in the East. And so, on an emergency basis, the leadership and the economy showed what the dominant feature of its economic system is. They did not allow the market to prevail. They intervened with planning. They raised pensions. They raised wages. They raised stipends to social welfare stipends. And they brought in the biggest infrastructure project in transportation ever done by any country in the world, any place. Among other things, they built high voltage utility lines. They did everything to reemploy the workers who lost their jobs, and they succeeded. And they also had economic growth while the rest of the capitalist world was in ruins, And they still have economic growth while Europe is stagnating or going down. The U.S. is creeping ahead, just trying to tread water this economy. And all the millions of workers who got put out in 2008 and 2009, they're still unemployed. Nice to see you all. Well, the daily vilification of China in the capitalist media about hacking and trying to take over industry all over the world, and exploiting the terrible accidents that happen in China to try to turn people against China, is all calculated to prepare the groundwork for the encirclement and hostility and possible war with China. The U.S. by 2020 will move 60% of its warships into the Pacific, right near the Chinese border. It's building anti-missile systems in Taiwan, in South Korea, in order to put forward defensive weapons which are really aggressive, because they're an attempt to be able to suppress missiles if you attack, and then it comes a counterattack. So the point is that there's a vilification campaign against China. You can read the New York Times any week and you'll find 3 or 4 articles in this direction. What I would like to do is turn this discussion, from my point of view, to trying to get an analysis of China, so that we can grasp it and understand what's at stake in the struggle to defend China against imperialism and against domestic counter-revolution. There's a great deal at stake. But before anybody can really begin to discuss this, they have to have an analysis of China, because it's a difficult situation in China. It's difficult to unravel. So I want to just start by saying that this is one of the most important questions of the 21st century, China, and what happens to it, and its relations with imperialism. And that the progressive and revolutionary movements of the world have a great stake in having a correct attitude towards China. And first of all, China is a formerly oppressed country that achieved liberation from British, French, German, US, Japanese imperialism by making one of the greatest revolutions in history in 1949, and really liberating what at that time was 1/4 of the human race. And as a formerly oppressed country struggling for national development, it must be defended against all varieties of imperialist military, economic, political aggression, regardless of what you think about its character. China is a new, complex, and contradictory phenomenon in history. It has fundamental socialist structures alongside capitalist development and imperialist penetration. The leadership calls it market socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism is inscribed firmly as the foundation of its constitution, yet workers in private industry are subjected to capitalist exploitation, and the workers in the state industries have lost much of the economic support that once attached to the factories and their places of employment. Only Marxism enables us to approach the analysis of China. Marxism has shown that the character of any society is determined by its economic foundation, and that the superstructure of society, its politics, its ideology, is determined by the economic foundation. How can such an analysis be applied to China, and how can it help us to clarify how to view China? The economic foundation of China is not homogeneous. It is partly socialist and partly capitalist. The question for us and for the world working class is, which is dominant? The socialist foundation or the capitalist enterprises seeking private accumulation of profit through exploitation of the working class? Similarly, the superstructure is not homogeneous. There's the Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army, the ideological doctrine that declares socialism as the foundation of China, but also opening up to imperialism and capitalist market reforms are necessary. Above all, political reform, meaning the right for the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie to organize politically inside the party or outside the party or both. That is the steady drumbeat of the imperialists and their class allies in China. So how can we assess the situation? We can start by an empirical examination of China on the one hand, and the rest of the capitalist world on the other hand. And a crucial example of how China dealt with the worst capitalist crisis since World War II is something that needs to be examined, because it will tell us a great deal about the class and social character of China. When the crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, many tens of millions of workers in the US, Europe, Japan, and across the capitalist world were plunged into unemployment. China, which had dangerously allowed itself to become heavily dependent on exports to the capitalist West, suddenly was faced with the shutdown of thousands of factories, primarily in the eastern coastal provinces and the special economic zones. More than 20 million Chinese workers lost their jobs in a very short time. And how did the Chinese government respond? And this is very important. I'm going to read from one of the articles in the collection over there on China. And the person and the source that I'm going to be referring to is the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Nicholas Lardy. These are bourgeois experts that actually advised China and advised the capitalist government here on how to get into China and penetrate it and change its internal development. So what does this group say about what happened in China during the economic crisis? When the crisis hit, central planners went into motion. Plans drafted as far back as 2003 to go into effect in future years were pushed forward and implemented. China, Nicholas Lardy describes how consumption in China actually grew during the crisis. Wages went up during the crisis. And the government created enough jobs to compensate for all the 20 million layoffs that took place during the crisis. In a year in which the GDP in China expanded rather slowly, but still expanded, how could consumption growth in 2009 have been so strong in relative terms? How could this happen at a time when employment in export-oriented industries was collapsing? With a survey conducted by the Ministry of Agriculture, the loss of 20 million jobs in export manufacturing centers in the southeast coast, notably in Guangdong province. The relatively strong growth of consumption in 2009 is explained by several factors. First, the boom in investment, particularly in construction activities, generated a great deal of additional employment. For the year as a whole, China created 11 million jobs in urban areas and matched that with 11.1 million jobs created in 2008. Second, while the growth of employment slowed slightly, wages continued to rise. In nominal terms, wages in the formal sector rose 12%, a few percentage points below the average of the previous 5 years. In real terms, the increase was almost 13%. Third, the government continued its program of increasing payments to those drawing pensions and raising the transfer payments to China's low-income residents. Monthly pension payments for enterprise retirees were increased by 10%, 120 billion renminbi. In January 2009, substantially more than the 5.9% increase in consumer prices. That is, the income went way above the increase in prices. This raised total payments to retirees by about 75 billion renminbi. The Ministry of Civil Affairs raised payments to about 70 million of China's lowest income citizens by a third. The Ministry of Railroads introduced 8 specific plans to be completed by 2020, but to be implemented in the crisis. The World Bank called it, quote, perhaps the biggest planned program of passenger rail investment there has ever been in one country. In addition, ultra-high voltage grid projects were undertaken and other advances. Okay, so this is the way the Chinese government, under the leadership of the Communist Party, reacted to the crisis. So, income went up, consumption went up, unemployment was overcome in China, and the capitalist world is still mired in mass unemployment, austerity, recession, stagnation, slow growth, and massive increasing poverty. The reversal of the effects of the crisis in China is the direct result of national planning, state-owned enterprises, state-owned banking, and the policy of the Chinese Communist Party. There was a crisis in China caused by the world capitalist crisis, the question of which principle would prevail in the face of mass unemployment: the rational, humane principle of planning or the capitalist market. In China, the planning principle, the conscious element, took precedence over the anarchy of production brought about by the laws of the market and by the law of labor value. But these very institutions, the remaining structures of the Chinese Socialist Revolution, which saved the masses from economic disaster, are the very institutions that the World Bank, the IMF, Wall Street, and world capitalism are trying to reduce and eventually destroy: the state-owned enterprises, government planning, and the Communist Party. One might say that the Chinese leadership did this to avoid unrest. But the capitalists in Europe and Japan and the US, they also want to avoid unrest. But that did not cause them to put tens of millions of workers back to work, raise pensions, raise stipends, and social welfare payments. It only caused them to institute austerity to pay off the bankers. Coming back to the Marxist analysis, it is clear from the way the Chinese leadership handled this crisis that the socialist side of the economic foundation is still dominant in China, and the same can be said for the political superstructure. It is claimed by the enemies of socialism that it is capitalism that is responsible for the great success in China. This is a falsehood. China has succeeded in its economic development because the socialist sector has broadly contained domestic capitalism and imperialist investment within the framework of national economic goals and of the leadership. Without the socialist institutions, China would look like India, which also has planning, but is a thoroughly capitalist country and is subordinated to world imperialism. In India, poverty is so deep, people live on garbage dumps, wash their clothes in polluted water, and the slums in Calcutta and Mumbai rival rural poverty to make the masses of India desperately poor. Even as the glittering high-tech industry develops alongside the abysmal economic conditions faced by hundreds of millions of Indians. There is no comparison to China. If the imperialists have their way, however, if they can destroy the socialist foundation and the Communist Party, they will turn China into another India. And that is what is at stake in the struggle to stop counter-revolution in China. This explanation and analysis should not be understood as support on our part for market socialism. In our view, the capitalist market is antagonistic to socialism. Under conditions of stark underdevelopment, such as China has been subjected to by imperialism and comprador capitalism and feudal landlordism, it can be necessary to make a retreat, but it is one thing to use capitalism as a temporary expedient to struggle against, to build the economy, and to be absorbed into the socialist sector at the end of it all. A retreat to the use of capitalism is not the same as enthroning capitalism as a partner with socialism. Private capitalism multiplies, accumulates, grows automatically, and so does the capitalist class and its petty bourgeois hangers-on. The present leadership is playing with fire by pushing the opening up and reform, opening up to imperialism and capitalist reform. What is needed in China is a return to the revolutionary spirit of the Mao Zedong generation. Bourgeois, who is now languishing in detention, and was the head of Chongqing, tried to revive the spirit of Mao Zedong in a limited way and represented a split in the leadership over the question of galloping down the road towards capitalism. They were trying to retard it and hold it up, but they were defeated. But the future has to bring a new day. They represented a left resistance to this advance, but the only thing that can really save China is the restoration of proletarian democracy, the political empowerment of the working class. But in the meantime, we must defend China against imperialist reaction and internal counter-revolution, no matter what form it takes. That's